FAQ for gardeners. Today we are going to discuss the answers to some of your most frequently asked questions. My name is Aaron Steil, and apart from being the assistant director at Reiman Gardens, I have the great fortune of being on the radio every week, answering gardening questions on a gardening advice radio show. And while I often get questions from lots of people in many different topic areas, there are a few questions I answer often, but I often don't have the opportunity to answer them as in-depth as I would like. So presented here are some more in-depth answers to some of the most common questions that I hear each week from gardeners just like yourself across Iowa. And hopefully it gives you a bit more background behind why we give the advice that we give. Also allows me to provide a little bit of visual, which I don't get to do very often on the radio. So without further ado, let's start answering some of those very frequently asked questions. The first one is, how do I turn my hydrangeas blue? And to start with this, not all hydrangeas have blue flowers. In fact, only one species in particular does this phenomena apply to. So we have to answer this question well, first determine which hydrangea you actually have. Now, throughout this presentation, I have a handful of quote-unquote quiz questions to help maybe be a bit more engaging and help think a little bit more about the topic as we discuss this. Please take a minute or so and consider this question. And if you like, you can pause this recording and take some time to write it down or talk to those that are around you if you have other folks in the room with you. So, which hydrangeas are typically grown in Iowa? Take a moment. If you need to pause the recording, you're welcome to do that. Which hydrangeas do you typically see in gardens in Iowa? In Iowa, there are 4 primary species of hydrangea. Now, these, of course, are not the only hydrangeas that can be grown in the state, but these are by far the most common ones. Starting with the smooth hydrangea, sometimes called the Annabelle hydrangea. This is a large green that turns to a kind of a creamy white that eventually fades to a brown ball-shaped flower. They're native to eastern North America, and they bloom on current year's growth, which is an important factor in our discussion in a little bit. These plants do die to the ground most years and grow up from their roots each spring and bloom. Another very common hydrangea is the panicle hydrangea. This has a more elongated or cone-shaped flower. It has, much like the Annabelle hydrangea, it has kind of creamy white flowers, but many varieties have a very nice pink color as well. These are more woody plants. They tend to be much larger. They do not die to the ground each year. They're native to Japan and China. And just like the smooth hydrangea, they bloom on current year's growth. The oak leaf hydrangea is probably the least common of the 4 presented here. Large, coarse oak leaf-shaped leaves grace this North American native. It has a wonderful red fall color, and just like the panicle hydrangea, the flowers are more elongated and cone-shaped and often have a nice amount of pink in them. Finally, the big leaf hydrangea is sometimes grown in Iowa. This Asian native, native to Japan, does change color based on the pH of the soil, and that is the hydrangea that you can potentially turn blue. This one, much like the oak leaf hydrangea, blooms on last year's growth, and that will be important to think about as we get further into this discussion. So, if you don't have a big leaf hydrangea, you cannot turn it blue, and that's where this question ends. But if you do have a big leaf hydrangea, then the color depends on the amount of aluminum ions in the soil, which is very much influenced by the soil pH. Now, changing soil pH is difficult. And for these flowers to have a really good blue color, we need a pH of 6 or below. Now, most soils in Iowa and actually much of the upper Midwest tend to be more alkaline. They tend to have a higher pH. So blue is really rare, and instead we tend to get a more pinkish color in these plants. Now, changing soil pH is a challenging venture because soil is very buffered and is very hard to alter in this way. And anything that you do to change the pH of the soil, those effects will be reversed as soon as you stop doing it. But if you want to try to go down this road, there are a few ways that you can do it. One is to add peat moss to the soil. Sphagnum peat moss is incredibly acidic. Incorporating it into the soil when you plant these in your garden and continuing to incorporate maybe top dress with peat moss throughout the years can help lower the pH in the immediate area of the root zone for these plants, hopefully lowering the pH in that area, making those aluminum ions more available and changing that color from pink to blue. Another thing you can do is fertilize with an acidic fertilizer. So these fertilizers are usually made up of ammonium sulfate or sulfur-coated urea, and not only do they feed the plant, quote unquote feed the plant, provide nutrition for the plant, but they can also change the pH needle. Now, they're not going to bring the pH down in as big of a way as maybe some of the other options presented here. But with consistent and frequent fertilizer applications utilizing these soil acidifying fertilizers, we can see the pH go down a little bit. As soon as you stop using them, though, that pH will likely change back to what it was to begin with. And many of these products, any well-stocked garden center will have these products, and they're usually named after things like hydrangeas, hollies, and rhododendrons, all which are plants that really appreciate more acidic soils. Finally, you can add elemental sulfur, aluminum sulfate to the soil. This doesn't have nutritional value for the plant in it, but it can change the pH of the soil and allow those flowers to be more blue in color. With that said, this is something that you have to do on a regular basis, and you have to add it to the soil typically seasonally, and as soon as you stop doing it, you will likely see the pH migrate back up to where it was before you started. An additional note about big leaf hydrangea: this is a challenging hydrangea to grow in Iowa. It is not winter hardy above ground, only the roots are winter hardy. And if you remember, we talked about certain hydrangeas blooming on last year's growth or previous year's growth, and this is one of them. So if the plant dies to the ground every winter, there is never last year's growth for it to bloom on. Now, there are some wonderful cultivars of this plant that bloom on current year's growth, the most notable being one called Endless Summer. But even these cultivars tend to peter out over time and less reliably bloom over time. So knowing that going into this, keep in mind that this type of hydrangea, the big leaf hydrangea, is not likely a long-term successful plant in your garden, but more of a short-term, short-lived plant for you. And going into it with that attitude sometimes can help a lot in your expectations for this plant. This may be the most common weed question I get. How do I kill Creeping Charlie? This is a very aggressive weed that can be difficult to control. This plant spreads through runners and seed. It does have pretty blue to purplish flowers in spring and a very strong mint-like odor. It's in the same family as mint. It's sometimes referred to as ground ivy, and it can be a very difficult weed to control, especially in turf situations. The plant is really well suited for shady and tough situations, and so when grass gets thin, this very easily comes in and takes over. And before we even talk about how do I kill this weed, I do want you to consider first, do you have to? This plant is well adapted to certain situations, and while it's not something that all of us want to see, it is not an unattractive plant. And remember, a weed is simply a plant that's unwanted. So if it's not a big deal, it can be wanted. Now, with that said, not all of us do want this weed. So how do you get rid of it? There are lots of kind of homespun methods that I have heard to control the spread of this very common weed. Take a moment now and consider and talk to those around you what methods you've heard to kill Creeping Charlie. If you need to, you can pause this recording and then come back. In a lawn situation, one of the big things to do is to try to improve conditions, keeping grass long, making sure it gets plenty of sun, making sure that grass is healthy and strong. It can compete better with Creeping Charlie. If you do have it, one of the only organic controls that you can use is hand pulling. But hand pulling is difficult. You have to be persistent and consistent in how often you do it. And any piece left behind of this little weed will easily continue to root and grow. So hand pulling persistently can sometimes control small areas of infestation of this weed, but large areas may be more difficult and require something a bit more invasive, like a herbicide. Make sure that if you do use a herbicide, that you apply that herbicide in the fall. And it will take 2 applications. Usually the best timing is one in late September, maybe early October, and then a second one 1 month later. And the herbicide that you use on your lawn should be one of these broadleaf herbicides or a mixture of them. The mixture of 2,4-D and triclopyr that you sometimes see in certain weed control products is particularly effective against Creeping Charlie, but any of these can be helpful. And it is beneficial to mix and match these between your applications. So one application may be 1 or 2 of the active ingredients, and another one may be a different one. You usually get better control when you do that. There is a strong urge to apply herbicides in the spring for these plants because that's when they're often really showy and when we first notice them. But spring herbicides are very ineffective. And in fact, in many cases, you're probably wasting more money than you are killing plants with this herbicide application in the spring. So do some hand pulling, try to keep it under control, promote a healthy lawn, and in the fall, address it with herbicides. There is also a lot of information out on the web about more quote-unquote organic approaches to Creeping Charlie, using things like borax or vinegar. And while these things may make a dent in the control of this weed, they are typically not nearly as effective as some of the other control methods we talked about. Once you have Creeping Charlie under control, make sure you're mowing at an appropriate height and keeping lawns healthy to prevent reinfestation. And when you do see it, take care of it right away. If you have this plant in a garden bed, it can be a bit more difficult because broadleaf herbicides can injure the plants that are in the garden bed as well. You'll have to rely on hand pulling and the careful application of either a broadleaf herbicide or a non-selective herbicide like glyphosate, again, in the fall. A lot of people really want a silver bullet for the control of this really pesky weed, but there really is no silver bullet. The secret to the control is to be persistent and consistent, doing it often and doing it at the appropriate time and doing it well. This may be the most common question I receive on a regular basis. And there are several reasons for that. This is a very popular vegetable. Tomato plants are by far the most common planted vegetable. And even if you don't have a full-fledged vegetable garden, there is a big chance that you might have 1 or 2 tomato plants. And for good reason. A homegrown tomato is delicious. So, how do you control the spots that almost always invariably show up on tomato plants? Now, there are several different diseases that can impact tomatoes, but these spots that show up on the plants early to midsummer and then infect the plant throughout the season, usually growing in size and causing the leaves to drop, is called either early blight or septoria blight. And they're both caused by 2 different fungus, Alternaria and septoria. And the control of both of these is very similar. So, how do you control this common disease? Well, to start, use healthy plants. Make sure that the plants you're buying don't already have this disease. And because it's so pervasive, this can happen occasionally. And there are no resistant cultivars out there. So you do have to just use other methods, cultural, maybe some fungicides, which we'll talk about in a little bit, to get this under control. Another thing to consider is good crop rotation. Keeping tomatoes and its relatives, potatoes, peppers, and eggplant out of the same area for at least 3 to 4 years is ideal. Now, rotating in this way can be really difficult for the typical home gardener. Most of us just don't have the space to avoid a whole section of your vegetable garden with all of those plants, tomatoes, potatoes, peppers, eggplant, for 4 years. But even if you can do it in a small way, it can help prevent this soil-borne pathogen from building up in the soil. It's good to have proper plant spacing. Tomatoes should be about 3 feet apart for good air circulation. This helps keep foliage dry, which helps prevent the fungus from spreading. And in relation to that, it's also good to get them up off the ground using tomato cages or other structures to get the foliage away from the soil. This starts in the soil when it splashes up on the leaves and then spreads from the bottom up on the plant. And so anything you can do to keep the plant as far away from the soil and keep soil from splashing is going to be beneficial. Mulch is another way to do that. Putting down 2 to 3 inches of something like grass clippings, straw, cocoa hulls, shredded leaves, those are all great options in the vegetable garden. But of course, things like wood mulch can be used too. It's just in that setting, we don't typically like to use a more permanent mulch like that. It keeps the water from splashing on the leaves, splashing soil on the leaves, and helps hopefully slow the infestation of this fungal disease. Along with that, avoid wetting the foliage whenever possible. Do not use overhead watering. Do not work in the plants when they are wet. Use soaker hoses or drip irrigation, or just directly water at ground level to keep the leaves dry. And if you do end up overhead watering, do so in the morning so that there's more time for those leaves to dry off and hopefully not promote the spread of this disease. As you notice it appear, and it's usually about mid-June when you start to see it on the plants, remove those lower leaves that have been affected. It can hopefully reduce the amount of spread, or at least slow it. If you can keep this disease from impacting your plants in a big way until much later in the season, you can still get a decent crop out of your plant, and the control of it won't be so important. Now, if you've tried all of these cultural things and you're still getting this disease in a big way, then using fungicides may be an option. Make sure those fungicides include some of the active ingredients listed here, and you'll want to apply it every 7 to 14 days, beginning about 3 or 4 weeks after transplanting, and it will happen throughout the growing season. Fungicides are much more effective as a preventative measure in many cases, and this is very true for this disease. Once it's there, you can't fix it, but you can prevent it. And starting with fungicides and utilizing them through the season, stopping later in the season, because once the tomatoes start setting fruit, usually you can still get a decent crop, even if there is a little bit of foliar damage. Good fall cleanup is another important thing. The fungal spores overwinter in the soil and in the plant debris. So doing a good job of removing that foliage in the fall is going to be important to be sure that we reduce the amount of fungal pathogen in the soil and hopefully reduce the likelihood of being infected in a big way. And finally, if you do have a lot of issues with this, you can always try a container. Now, this has some drawbacks, but one of the great benefits is you can use potting soil, which is sterile. and won't have this pathogen in it. Now, over time, even the large container can build up with this pathogen. And not all tomatoes do great in a container. Some of them just get really large. Keeping a container watered, especially late in the season, can be a little bit difficult. But if you're having big issues with this plant and you can't do good crop rotation, then using a container might be an option for you. If tomato blight on tomatoes is the most common question, this is probably the most common lawn-related question we hear. How do you grow grass in the shade? And the short of this answer is you don't. Turf just does not do well in the shade. And the thin grass invites weeds that can tolerate more shade, like creeping Charlie and violets. So there are a couple of options if you have a lot of shade in your yard. The first is you can create more sun. Limbing up trees, removing fences or buildings that are causing this issue will create more sun, which the turf prefers and will grow better in. Now, this is not typically a desirable option. So your other option is to continue to be frustrated and try to grow grass. This is an area, even the more shade-tolerant grasses like creeping red fescue, chewing fescue, or hard fescue want more sun than typical shade plant. So when you have less than 4 hours of direct sunlight, you're going to have difficulty growing turf, even the quote-unquote more shade-tolerant turf species. But this is a good place to start if you require grass in an area that has a lot of shade. Finally, you can establish something other than turf. And while this may seem like a lot of work at first, it's certainly a lot less work in the long haul if you have an appropriate plant for a shady location rather than turf. Now, what options do you think exist to plant in shady situations that are not turf? Take a minute, pause, ask those around you, and list a few options for plants or other things that might work well other than turf. Now, you can just mulch these areas, and sometimes the mulch looks better than thin and really sad-looking turf. And it can still be used when you mulch these areas. It can still be used in much the same way that you would use the turf area in terms of being able to walk on it and do activities on it. Many times the trees would love to not be competing with the root systems of the grass for water and nutrients, and so the trees would benefit from this too. But if you want to have plants, there are a lot of really wonderful spreading plants for shade, and these are just a few of them. You can see the list here. Of particular note, I want to bring up sedges. There are literally hundreds of different kinds of sedges, and the Pennsylvania sedge is one of the best shade lawn alternatives. It does, many of the sedges are more clump forming, so you do have to kind of plant them and they create little mounds that eventually grow together. But Pennsylvania sedge grows a little bit more like turf, and all of the sedges are very grass-like, but they tolerate much more shade than grasses do. And so these can be really nice options if you're wanting that turf look, but have a very shady situation. Bugleweed, wild ginger, geraniums, hostas, pachysandra, foamflower, these are all potential options that do and tolerate shade much better than turf does. There's a couple on this list that I want to bring particular attention to, numbers 11 and 12. Goutweed and lily of the valley are both very aggressive spreaders that do well in the shade, but sometimes can do a little too well. So use these plants with caution and make sure that you have natural barriers to prevent rampant spread of these two ground covers in particular. Sometimes vinca falls into this group too, as can ajuga when it's really happy. But these others in particular pachysandra, the wild ginger, geranium for a little bit more sun. All of these are really wonderful possibilities for shady situations over turf. This critter might be one of the most frustrating animals related to gardening, and deer damage can be extensive. Deer do really well in urban and especially suburban environments, and they feed on an incredibly large range of plants. Now, they do have some favorites, things like hosta, arborvitae, yew, apples, roses, burning bush, clematis, redbud, rhododendrons, and Norway maples are frequently browsed. And many of those plants are popular garden plants, and so we often see the damage that results from them being in your garden. And effective management of deer usually takes multiple approaches. And so we'll talk about some of those approaches. And in many cases, mixing and matching these to create a situation that will leave your deer alone or leave your garden alone will be most effective. Now, everybody out there has heard lots of different methods for controlling deer. What methods have you heard of or tried in your own garden? Take a moment, pause if you need to, talk to those around you, write down a couple of things. So, how do you keep deer away? Well, one option is to plant more deer-resistant plants. If you have a lot of deer pressure, hosta is probably not a good plant for you. Arborvitae is probably not a great hedge option for you because they are favorites. They are like the pizza and chicken nuggets for deer. So instead, what plants are out there that are a bit more like the, Brussels sprouts for deer, where maybe they might browse on it, but they're usually not preferred. Typically plants that have thorns, a strong fragrance, or stiffly hairy leaves are less likely to be browsed. And there are many lists out there, all you have to do is Google it to find a quote-unquote deer resistant plants. And almost everybody will run into somebody who has said, oh, but I've seen them eat mine. And while this may be true, planting more deer-resistant plants is going to reduce the amount of damage that you see. Some of these include things like barberry, rhodosier dogwood, forsythia, honey locust, beauty bush. Many of the spruces, in particular Norway spruce, white spruce, and Colorado spruce. Many of the pines, particularly Mugo, Austrian, and Scotch pine, although they are known to browse relatively common on eastern white pine. And lilac is typically avoided as well. So those are plants that you can look at if you have a lot of deer pressure. You can also use repellents, and repellents are really about temporary relief. They have to be reapplied often. They quickly wear out or wash away. And it's really important that if you do use repellents, that you mix up what you use so that the deer don't get used to certain scents or tastes. Because once they do, then it's no longer effective. You can really break repellents into two major groups. There's the contact or the taste repellents, and there's the area or smelly repellents. And with the contact repellents, they need to taste them. They don't taste good, and they'll leave the plant alone. When you apply these, you should focus on the new growth because that's most likely to be eaten. And you can see here in this picture, that is what deer browsing looks like. They rip and tear plants, unlike rabbits, which make a clean cut with their teeth. And so if you see damage like this, it's usually because of deer. If the plant is small, you can apply these taste or contact repellents to the entire plant. But you can't really use these kinds of repellents on food crops because, of course, you need to eat them as well. And things like hot sauce and thyme are two examples of taste repellents. Now, area repellents or smell repellents can be more cost-effective than the contact ones because you can apply them just on the perimeter of your garden, and it repels deer based solely on their smell. And there are lots and lots of options when it comes to area repellents. Things that are made from rotten eggs or predator urine like coyote urine, blood meal, mothballs, human hair, bar soap. All of these are examples of things that folks may try and use to be smelly to deer and repel them away from your garden. Again, these tend to be temporary relief, and deer over time can very quickly get used to them. Scare devices can also be used. They are also only useful for a few weeks, but one of the things you can try to do with scare devices is break their patterns. Deer are very habitual, and once they have their routes and their paths, they use them often. So if you can do something to change that, you can hopefully get a little relief in your garden from their browsing. These scare devices include things like exploders that make loud noises at regular intervals, but keep in mind that they will get used to that interval and know that it's not dangerous. Dogs can be great deer control, but deer very quickly understand what limits the dogs have in terms of where they can go. If they're on a tie-out or have a fence, deer will learn very quickly how far they can go and browse just beyond that. You can also fire guns or fire off fireworks. If you do decide to use scare devices, they need to be moved around a lot because, as I mentioned, they can get really used to the intervals or the boundaries. The most effective way to keep deer away are fences, but they tend to be the most expensive option. And so if you've tried all these other things and are frustrated, building a barrier is likely your best option. There are two types. There's the passive fence, which is essentially a tall fence. It needs to be at least 8 foot tall. It needs to go all the way to the ground. Typically a woven wire like hog panel can work really well. And the way that fencing is sold, you can usually buy a 12-foot stake, put it 4 feet in the ground, and then attach 2 hog panel fencing panels on top of each other to create the barrier. You can also use active forms. This would be like electric fences, but electric fences, you have to train deer to know to avoid them. So they have to be baited in some way so that they touch them, get shocked, and go away. Usually a little bit of foil with peanut butter is the best way to do this. And over time, deer can learn that they can just jump over these fences. So they may not work as well as a tall fence, a passive fence, but they are usually a lot less cheaper. They're a lot less expensive. And of course, you can also just protect individual plants using tubes, posts, or cylinders of wire fence. If the plants are small, make sure you put a cover over the top of those cylinders so they can't reach down inside, so to prevent the browsing that may occur. And the other thing that deer occasionally do in the fall is utilize small trees to rub the velvet off of their antlers. And 3 posts positioned about 18 inches apart can prevent them from using a brand new plant, a newly planted tree for this. The damage that does is pretty extensive and can happen really quickly. So protecting those young plants from deer rubbing is very beneficial. This question is kind of a little bit more general, but it's something I hear often people ask me. And it's essentially, it starts off with, what should I spray to get rid of fill in the blank? An insect, a disease, a weed, whatever it may be. What can I spray to get rid of it? This seems to be the go-to question because many gardeners think there is a very quick and simple answer. And in reality, spraying should be the last option that you use because there's a lot of other things that can be done that are much less negatively impactful on the environment and your garden and yourself than spraying. So gardening just isn't this cut and dry. And actually, I'm kind of thankful it isn't. How boring would gardening be if it were this cut and dry? An integrated approach is much more effective and sustainable. And that integrated approach is referred to as integrated pest management, or IPM. Take a moment now, remind yourself, or ask those around you, what is IPM? Integrated pest management, or IPM, is a great thing. And it really assumes that there's not a one-size-fits-all approach to dealing with any particular problem. And that's what this question seems to kind of infer or assume. Instead, IPM requires you to think about your garden more holistically. Remember, it is an ecosystem, and every action has a ripple effect. The wrong action may do a little bit of good, like kill a pest insect, but cause a lot of bad as well. So maybe also kill all of the good insects and other pollinators in your garden. But the right, more integrated action will not only promote good things in your garden, but discourage the bad things. So this is why taking this IPM approach to problems, rather than just taking a step back, or rather than just asking, what can I spray to get rid of this, is a much bigger approach. And this is hard for me to talk about on the radio. I don't often have a lot of time to discuss this. And so what can I spray is actually probably the last thing on the list. To take an integrated approach, you want to start with first accurately identifying the issue. You can't do any appropriate corrective measures unless you know accurately what you're dealing with. And to do this, you often want to inspect for insects and disease and other issues early and deal with them sooner rather than later. So a frequent scouting, I often use the time that I take watering, for example, to scout for issues or to look for issues that may be going on in my garden in hopes of catching them early. The next thing to consider is, do I actually need to do anything? What I am seeing right now is very likely to turn into something bigger? Or is this pretty much what it is? And the damage is actually, when you really think about it, not that big of a deal. Remember, most of us aren't growing stuff to show at the state fair. A few spots or holes in the leaves are not a big deal. And we may not need to do anything, especially if we're fairly confident that it's not going to turn into something bigger. The next thing to consider is, how can I prevent these issues? So making sure that the right plant is in the right place is one of the best ways to prevent issues. Plants that are under stress because they're in the wrong environmental conditions are more likely to have pest and disease issues. So getting them in the right place, doing crop rotation, all of those things can help. Is there a resistant cultivar I can buy? I often run into folks who have crab apples that lose leaves by midsummer because of some really impactful fungal diseases, but there are varieties of crabapple out there that are less susceptible to those diseases and more likely to have foliage late into the season because of it. So plant those plants instead. Be sure that what you do buy not only is resistant to a common disease, but also itself is healthy and clean. And maybe it makes sense to remove any pieces that you see. So if there's just one branch that has a lot of aphids on it or a lot of scale on it, then just prune that branch out. Make sure that you're spacing plants appropriately to get good air circulation, and staking and caging those plants to keep them up off the ground, again, to get good air circulation. Anything that is close to the ground or close together is more likely to have disease issues. And remove hiding place for pests as well. If you're having a lot of issues with rabbits in your garden, then the wood pile right next to the garden may be part of the issue. And moving that pile so the rabbits don't have a place to hide could help with that. Next, you'll want to consider and alter cultural practices. Things like making sure you water in the morning instead of the evening if you have a lot of disease issues, so that things have all day to dry out instead of sitting wet all night. Watering at the base or using drip irrigation systems. Not over-fertilizing. Over-fertilized plants grow more quickly, but they often have weak growth that's more susceptible to pests and disease. And using mulch. If you're not using mulch already, using mulch can make plants healthier and happier, which are more resistant to problems and can help the spread of problems. Case in point are our tomato blight issues. Now, if you've done a lot of those practices and you're still seeing the issues, the next step might be to use some sort of mechanical control. For insects and other pests, maybe netting, screens, fences, or row covers can exclude those problem pests. And this isn't always an option. So for example, with squash, there are lots of different bugs that a row cover could help exclude, but they would also exclude the pollinator. And pollinators are required to get good fruit set on things like squash. So that wouldn't be a great option for squash, but for other plants, it could be the perfect option. If you have birds that are constantly picking all the fruit off of your cherry tree, putting a net over it can help prevent them from doing that. You can also use sticky cards. While sticky cards are great for tracking and seeing problems and hopefully identifying them before they become huge issues, they're not great control measures. Pheromone traps fall into this category as well. And sometimes they can feel really satisfying because when infestations are bad, you can catch a lot of things this way. But especially for insects, these are really more monitor devices than anything else. You can also just handpick or prune off problem things. If you notice just one section of the plant has the issue, removing that as quickly as possible to prevent it from spreading to other areas may be all that's needed to keep that problem low enough that it doesn't impact yields or cause negative impacts on how it appears. Things like a forceful spray of water to remove aphids are an example of this as well. You can also use biological control. Introducing natural pest predators can be a great way. So things like buying and releasing lady beetles, lacewings, or praying mantids in your garden to increase the amount of natural predators that can hopefully feed and destroy some of those pest insects that you might have, or providing a habitat that promotes more of those natural predators to be in the area. So having good plant diversity so that you can increase the number of good insects that are in the area. It could be as simple as providing a place for a bird to perch so that they can get in there and get those problem insects, or having a red-tailed hawk have a great place to sit so they can take care of your little bunny problem. IPM doesn't mean you don't use pesticides. You'll just notice it's the last thing on the list. So rather, one of the things that's really important to consider about this question, what should I spray? There's actually at least six questions to ask before you get to that one. If you work through all of those things and they still are not adequately controlling the problem that you're having in your garden, then pesticides may be an option. Some kind of insecticide, fungicide, or herbicide to control those insects, disease, or weed pressures can work. But use them as a last resort. Always use as the label directs, and work hard to avoid off-target spraying. So spraying when pollinators aren't active so that the insecticide you're putting down doesn't impact them negatively, but hopefully still impacts the pest negatively. And I always work to try to do an organic option first. If an insecticidal soap will work for the problem that I have, I will start with that over something that's maybe a bit more, is a bit stronger. The last question I want to talk to you about is one that I love talking about and love answering. And this is something that's on a lot of people's minds right now. How can I attract more pollinators to my garden? Insects of all kinds can be beneficial pollinators in the garden. And by and large, most of the insects that live in our garden have no negative and in many cases, many positive impacts on our plants. So promoting them can be really beneficial. Common pollinators can include things like butterflies, some moth species, all sorts of different bees, from bumblebees, honeybees, and other solitary species that are native to the state. But other things like hoverflies and flower beetles are also good potential pollinators. So if we want to invite all of these critters to our garden, what are some things we can do in our garden to promote them? Take a moment, pause if you need to, discuss with those around you some of the things that we can do to create a garden that is friendly for pollinators. Step 1 is full sun. The insects and nearly all of the plants that they utilize grow in full sun. And many of these insects want to be in more sunlight, so finding a good location that has full sun is going to be the first step to establishing a good pollinator-friendly garden. You'll also want to have food sources, pollen and nectar sources for these, and these typically come from the plants that you select. Now, the plants that are Iowa native are going to be better alternatives, but they don't all have to be native plants to attract pollinators. When you do put these in your garden, plant them in groups, not rows. They're easier for those insects to utilize. And try to offer a wide variety of flower shapes and colors to attract the most diverse number of pollinators. Try to plant so that there's always something in bloom from spring to fall throughout the season. And some plants that you might consider include things like clover, goldenrod, coneflower, all of which are native. Zinnia and salvia are great options too, although they aren't native. They still promote and feed pollinators. Linden trees, buttonbush, shrubs, wild rose, and elderberry are also nice native woody plants that can promote and provide food sources for different pollinators. Host plants are another important consideration, especially when it comes to butterflies. Remember that for nearly all these insects, the adult phase that you're seeing, especially with butterflies, is just one part of their life cycle. And most butterflies in particular need an alternate plant for their caterpillars. And these host plants provide the food that those larval stage needs. And for most butterflies in particular, there's a very specific species that's required. And so if there are certain butterfly species or other insects that you're looking to promote, take a peek and Google what they require for their host plants. So for example, the regal fritillary is a wonderful native butterfly that needs violets as a host plant. So if that is something you're trying to encourage in your garden, make sure that you have violets in your garden. A water source is important, but this isn't necessarily a bird bath or a pond, although those could work. It's really just moisture that they're looking for. And it could be as simple as having places in your garden where water can puddle and allow these insects to take advantage of. It could be a pond, a stream, a bird bath with rocks in it so that they have some place to land and utilize that space, because all of these insects, butterflies in particular, are not going to be able to use the open water. They're going to be using the edges. That's why something like a container of wet sand can sometimes work really well. If you do have still water features in your pollinator garden, you'll want to change the water in them at least every 2 to 3 days to prevent mosquito breeding. Rocks are also important. They are warm, and this is a great place for them to warm their bodies so that they can fly around and do their thing. Sometimes the path is a perfect place for this. You just have to watch where you step. Shelter is also really important. This can be as simple as trees and shrubs. Remember, pollinator gardens aren't just flowers from annuals and perennials, but the flowers from trees and shrubs, and the protection those trees and shrubs provide is really beneficial. Make sure you consider fences. It could be rock piles, twig piles, even just some leaf litter are all potential shelters. You can also introduce things like bee houses, especially for the solitary bees, which can be beneficial. And in this picture, you see a butterfly house. And while those are cute, they really don't house butterflies. So if you want to introduce these in your garden, you are more than welcome to use them as decorative objects. But no, they are not actually a home for butterflies. In fact, they're probably more likely to be a home for wasps or bees. And of course, protecting these insects and pollinators from pesticides is really important. Limiting the pesticide use that you use in the garden and nearby will go a long way, because remember, these are insects too in many cases, and pesticides don't know which insects are good and bad. So when you apply them, they impact both good and bad. So reducing the amount that you use, utilizing them responsibly when you do use them is going to be really important. And finally, if you want to call all pollinators to your garden, you're going to have to maybe be a little less tidy than you're used to. And for some gardeners, this might be the hardest part about being mindful of pollinators. An untidy garden is really what most of these pollinator insects want to see. Things a little on the wild side. So to do this, we would not clean up in the fall. There's a lot of insects that benefit and overwinter in that kind of untidy space. So you'll want to be sure that you leave that work for the spring. And it's okay to leave a few weed species in the garden. For example, things like milkweed, nettle, and violets are all important host plants for a lot of different native Iowa butterflies. And removing all of those weeds does not promote them in your garden. So maybe you don't let it go rampant, but leaving a few of those things for those insects is going to be one of the best ways to get more pollinators in your garden. Those were just a couple of the very common questions. Of course, you probably have questions of your own. And if you don't have an expert sitting right next to you to answer those questions 24/7, there are resources out there to help you. If you have more questions, one of my favorite places to start is Horticulture and Home Pest News, offered by Iowa State University Extension Horticulture. They have a great searchable database of questions, and I encourage you to bookmark this page and use it as often as you want to answer some of your questions. What's wonderful is that the information presented on this site is specific to Iowa and works well for all of us in this great state. Of course, you can contact a master gardener. The mission of the master gardeners, as most of you are well aware, is to provide current and research-based information and education on gardening to the citizens and their community. And as you learn more information, sharing that with other people and being a resource as a master gardener is really beneficial. And going to your local extension office is, of course, the best way to get connected with all of these experienced and trained gardeners. You can also call the Hortline or email the Hortline with your very specific questions, and the number and email there is on the screen. It's also easily found on the Horticulture and Home Pest News website. And finally, if you have something that just seems to perplex you and your master gardener friends, submitting a sample to the Plant and Insect Diagnostic Clinic is an option. Now, fee may apply depending on how you're submitting that sample, but you can get very specific answers to your questions utilizing this wonderful service from Iowa State University Extension. So that's always a consideration as well. Now, I can't come in here as Assistant Director of Reiman Gardens and not very briefly mention this wonderful garden in Ames. Opened in 1995, it's 17 acres. We're open year-round, 7 days a week. In fact, there's only 3 days of the year we're closed. It's Thanksgiving Day, Christmas Day, and New Year's Day. We have wonderful collections of a wide variety of plants, but we also specialize in, of course, butterflies, roses, and native prairie plants. One of the things that we do each year that really creates some very creative spaces in the garden are theme years. We pick a theme, and the garden and all the educational programming that we do revolves around that theme, and it allows us to do all of those things that you see there on the screen as a staff. And we come up with some really wonderful programs, displays, and ideas to show to the public each year because of those themes. Some places you'll see when you visit Reiman Gardens include our butterfly flight house, the butterfly wing, which is shaped like a butterfly. There are at least 800 butterflies of 50 different species flying around in that wonderful flight house year-round. We also have a great conservatory that changes in a big way. It features holiday displays, orchids, spring bulbs, and fall plants, depending on the season that you visit. We have wonderful rose gardens that include a world renowned collection of Buck roses. These are roses that were developed by Dr. Buck at Iowa State University that are naturally more disease resistant and winter hardy than your typical hybrid tea or floribunda rose. We have a wonderful herb garden. We also have what we call our campanile garden, which features many annual displays from tulips in the spring to very colorful annuals in the summer and fall. Lake Helen features lots of great water plants. The Town and Country Garden is a great place to get ideas for your own home garden. And the Children's Garden is a great spot to interact with the garden with any kids or grandkids that might be with you. I hope you get a chance at some point to come and visit us in Ames. We're located just south of Jack Trice Stadium on the edge of Iowa State University's campus.